The widow stood at the edge of a canyon she had never seen before, and the heat rising from the rock below hit her face like the breath of something alive. 6 months from now, on the coldest night anyone in this territory could remember, she would sit inside a shelter she built with her own hands, while the world outside tried to kill everything it touched. She would press her back against warm stone and read aloud from a Bible she could barely see, her voice steady, her hands calm. A young woman she had never met would sleep wrapped in blankets against that same stone wall, alive because a door opened when it could have stayed shut. And a dog, old and gray and faithful beyond reason, would lie curled at their feet, his body offering what little warmth it still held. But that was later. That was winter. This was summer, and the woman standing at the canyon's edge was not yet the person who would do those things. She was just a widow with dust on her boots and a decision behind her that she could not take back. Her name was Astrid Engen. She was 55 years old, and she had just chosen to die on her own terms rather than disappear in someone else's house. The summer had begun with blood. Eirik Engen coughed into his handkerchief on a morning when the light was still new, and the air smelled like sage and dust, and the particular sweetness of high desert grass after a cool night. He told his wife not to worry. He was 58 years old. He had cleared land, built fences, dug irrigation ditches, and raised 2 sons on this high plateau in the American West. A little cough meant nothing. But Astrid saw the red stains spreading across the white cloth, and she knew. She had seen this before. In Norway, when she was a girl, her uncle had coughed blood into his handkerchief and told everyone not to worry. 3 months later, they buried him in the churchyard, while snow fell on the mourners' shoulders. She remembered the sound of dirt hitting the coffin lid. She remembered her mother's hand gripping hers so tightly it left marks. She remembered thinking that grown-ups lied about things that mattered, and that the word nothing was the most dangerous word in any language, because people only used it when the thing they were hiding was too large to name. Eirik lasted 5 weeks. In those weeks, Astrid watched her husband become a stranger to his own body. The man who had split fence rails with an axe heavier than a child could not lift a cup of water to his lips. The man who had argued with her about crop prices and weather predictions and whether the fence line needed moving 6 inches north could not finish a sentence without stopping to breathe. His chest rattled when he inhaled, a wet sound that filled the small bedroom like something knocking from inside a wall. His hands, which had built this house and cleared this land and held her face on their wedding night, lay on the quilt like objects that no longer belonged to him. His eyes stayed the same. That was the cruelest part. His mind was sharp and clear and fully aware of what was happening to the body it lived in, like a lantern burning bright inside a house that was collapsing around it. She held his hand on the morning he died. She felt the moment his grip loosened. Not all at once, not a dramatic release, just a gradual softening, like a rope going slack, like the tension leaving a bow that would never be drawn again. She felt the exact instant when 33 years of partnership ended in a small bedroom in a farmhouse they had built together. His eyes were open, looking at her, and then they were looking at nothing. The difference between those two things was so small. A shift in focus, a light going out behind glass. And yet, it was the largest distance she had ever witnessed, larger than the ocean she had crossed to come to this country, larger than the years stretching behind her, and the years that might stretch ahead. She did not scream. She did not cry. She sat beside him for an hour, holding his cooling hand, while their dog Flint lay at the foot of the bed and whimpered softly. Flint was 12 years old, gray around the muzzle, his hips stiff in the mornings, his eyes beginning to cloud at the edges. He had been Irik's dog first, a puppy abandoned on a trail, half-starved and shaking, ribs showing through matted fur. Irik had carried him home inside his coat, and the puppy had pressed his nose against the man's chest and stopped shaking. And that was the end of his old life, and the beginning of his real one. 12 years. The dog had never forgotten whose warmth had saved him. Then Astrid washed her husband's body. She dressed him in his Sunday clothes, the ones he wore to church and to town, and to the occasional wedding or funeral of someone else's husband. She buttoned his shirt slowly, each button a small act of tenderness that no one else would ever see. The coat was the hardest part. Irik's wool coat, the one he wore every winter, the one that still smelled like pipe tobacco and lanolin, and something underneath that was simply him. A scent she could not name, but would recognize in a dark room among 1,000 other coats. She hung it on the hook by the door, where it had always hung, and she did not wash it. She did not intend to ever wash it. The smell would fade on its own. She knew that. The lanolin would dry. The tobacco would thin. Eventually, the coat would smell like any other coat, and that was its own kind of death. Smaller than the first, but no less final. But she would not hurry it. She sent word to her sons. Gunnar and Tollef arrived 2 days later for the funeral. Gunnar was 34, the eldest, with his father's strong jaw and his father's blue eyes, but none of his father's patience. Patience had been Irik's great virtue, the thing that let him wait for crops and weather and children to become themselves in their own time. Gunnar had no use for waiting. He dismounted first. He always dismounted first. Tollef was 30, quieter, always a step behind his brother, always watching Gunnar's face before deciding what his own face should do. They had been this way since they were boys, Gunnar leading, Tollef following, and the distance between leading and following growing wider every year, until it had become something that looked less like brotherhood and more like hierarchy. They buried Irik on a hillside overlooking the land he had worked. Astrid stood at the grave while the minister read from Scripture, and she thought about the first time she and Irik had seen this valley. They had been young then, newly arrived from Norway, full of hope and terror in equal measure. Irik had pointed at the flat land near the creek and said, "There, we will build there." His voice had been steady, not confident exactly, but decided. He had a way of making decisions that left no room for the possibility that he might be wrong. Not because he was arrogant, but because he understood that out here, hesitation was a luxury that could cost you a season, and a lost season could cost you everything. And they had built. Stone by stone, board by board, season by season, until the raw land became a farm, and the farm became a life. and the life became the thing she was now burying on a hillside, while the wind pulled at her hair and the minister's words scattered like seeds across dry ground. A few weeks after the funeral, her sons returned. Astrid was in the kitchen when she heard the horses. She was rolling dough for bread, the way she had rolled dough thousands of times in this kitchen, on this table, in this house, on this land that she and Eric had cleared with their own hands. The table had scratches she could read like scripture. Here, where Gunnar had carved his initials at age 7 and been scolded and then held, because Eric understood that a boy who carved his name into a table was a boy trying to prove he existed. Here, where Eric's knife had slipped while cutting rope one winter night, leaving a gouge in the wood that Astrid had traced with her finger 1,000 times since. Here, where a pot of hot stew had left a ring-shaped burn when the boys were small and the fire was high and everything felt permanent. She wiped the flour from her fingers and went to the door. Gunnar dismounted first. He was carrying a leather satchel, the kind that held important papers. Tollef stayed on his horse, looking at the ground, not at his mother, not at his brother, at the ground, as if he were studying something there that required all his attention, though there was nothing to see but dirt and hoofprints and the shadow of a man who could not bring himself to be present for what was about to happen. "Mother," Gunnar said, "we need to talk." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Astrid had served 15 years of meals, where she had nursed sick children and celebrated holidays, and argued with her husband about crop prices and weather predictions, and all the small negotiations that make up a marriage. Gunnar spread the documents across its surface, across the scratches and burns and the invisible history of 10,000 meals. "The law is clear," he said. "Father's land passes to me as eldest son. This is territorial statute. This is how things are done." Astrid said nothing. She looked at the papers, at the legal language she could barely understand, at her son's signature already at the bottom of one page. Already signed. Before he came. Before he asked. Before he sat at this table and pretended that what he was doing was a conversation rather than a sentence. "You have a choice," Gunnar continued. He was not meeting her eyes. He was looking at the documents, at his own hands, at the table where he had eaten his mother's food for 18 years before leaving to build his own life. "You can live here in this house with us. Dagny and I will take care of you. You can help with the children. You will be comfortable." "In my own home," Astrid said quietly. "In our home." Gunnar's jaw tightened. The muscle moved beneath the skin like something trapped. "You would be a guest, Mother. Dagny runs the household now. You would not interfere with her decisions. A guest. In the house she had built. At the table she had made. In the kitchen where she had cooked more meals than she could count. Under the authority of a daughter-in-law who would rearrange her cupboards and change her recipes and move the furniture to different walls and slowly, politely, thoroughly erase every trace of the woman who had made this place what it was. Astrid would sit in a corner room and be comfortable. She would eat meals she did not cook at times she did not choose. She would watch her grandchildren grow up in her own house and have no say in how they were raised. She would be fed and sheltered and warm and absolutely, completely invisible. "What is my other choice?" Gunnar reached into the satchel and pulled out another document. Father filed a claim years ago for water rights in a canyon east of here. The creek shifted underground before he could develop it. The land is worthless for farming, worthless for ranching, but it is in your name. Astrid took the paper. She recognized Eirik's handwriting, his signature, the careful way he had filled out the legal forms. She remembered him talking about that canyon, about his plans to run cattle there if the water held. She remembered the day he came back and told her the creek had disappeared into the earth, swallowed by the rock, as if the land itself had changed its mind. "Rocks," she said. "You are offering me rocks. I am offering you a choice." Gunnar finally looked at her, and his eyes were hard, harder than she had ever seen them. Not angry, something worse than angry. Certain. "You can stay here and be comfortable, or you can go live on your land and—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The end of that sentence was a grave, and they both knew it. Tollef spoke for the first time. "Gunnar, maybe we should—" "Be quiet." Gunnar did not look at his brother. "Mother, I need your decision." Astrid looked around the kitchen, at the stove where she had cooked, at the window where she had watched her children grow from small to tall, from helpless to capable, from hers to their own. At the door where Eirik's coat still hung on its hook, still smelling faintly of him, the scent fading a little more each day, like a voice growing distant across a field. She thought about living here as a guest, about Dagny's polite tolerance and Gunnar's authority, and the slow erosion of everything she had been. About sitting in a small room while other people made decisions about the house she had built, the land she had cleared, the life she had created. She thought about rocks, about a canyon where no one could farm, and no one could ranch, and no one, according to everyone who knew anything about survival in this territory, could possibly live through a winter. "The canyon," she said. Gunnar stared at her. "What?" "I choose the canyon, Mother." Tollef leaned forward, his face pale. "Mother, you cannot survive there. There is no timber for building, no flat ground for farming, no—" "I choose the canyon." Gunnar stood up slowly. His face went through several things: shock, confusion, anger, something that might have been guilt, moving fast and deep like a fish beneath dark water, there and gone before anyone could be sure they had seen it. Then his face settled into a mask, the kind of mask a man puts on when he has done something he knows is wrong and has decided to do it anyway, and needs his face to agree with his decision, even if his stomach does not. "Then that is your decision," he said. "I will have the papers filed. You will need to leave this house by month's end." He gathered his documents and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, not turning around. "You can visit whenever you like, Mother, but this is how it must be." Then he was gone. Tollef hesitated. He opened his mouth as if to say something, closed it, opened it again. The words were right there, visible behind his teeth, pressing against his lips. But they could not get past whatever wall his brother had built inside him over 30 years of following. He touched Astrid's shoulder briefly, a gesture so small it was almost nothing. The ghost of the boy who used to climb into her lap when thunder shook the house. Then he followed his brother out. Astrid sat alone at the kitchen table while the sound of hooves faded into silence. Flint padded over and laid his head on her knee, his brown eyes looking up at her, with the particular confusion of a dog who understands that something is wrong, but not what, who knows that the people who belong here have left, and the person who remains is hurting in a way that cannot be fixed with warmth or closeness, though he will offer both anyway, because that is all he knows how to do. "Well," Astrid said to the dog, "it seems we are going to live in a canyon." If you were Astrid, 55 years old, newly widowed, with a few dollars in your pocket and a dog at your feet, what would you choose? To live as a ghost in your own home, dependent on a son who sees you as a burden? Or to die free on your own land, a few dozen acres of rock that everyone says will kill you? Take a moment. Think about it, because the decision she just made will define the rest of her life. The descent took most of a morning. Astrid rode her old mule down a trail so steep the animal balked twice and had to be coaxed forward with a firm hand and a steady voice. Flint trotted alongside, his tongue hanging, his aging legs working harder than they had in years. The trail switched back down hundreds of feet of cliff face. With each turn, the canyon walls rose higher around her, sandstone ribbons of rust and cream and pale gold, carved by a creek that had run dry long before any settler set foot on this land. Juniper trees clung to the slopes like survivors, their roots gripping cracks in the rock, their branches twisted by wind into shapes that looked almost human. The canyon floor was hotter than the rim. The sandstone walls held the summer sun and threw it back concentrated, so that Astrid could feel the heat radiating off the rock as she walked, a physical pressure against her skin. Sweat soaked through her dress before she had gone 100 yards. She found a flat spot near the south wall where the fallen rock had settled into something approaching level ground. She unpacked the mule. She spread her canvas and sat on it and ate a handful of flour mixed with water, not because she was hungry, but because she knew she would need her strength. Then she looked at what she had. Rock. Miles of rock in every direction. Sandstone boulders tumbled from the cliffs above, smaller stones scattered across the canyon floor, like the discarded pieces of some enormous game no one remembered how to play. The juniper trees she had seen from the rim were fewer than she had hoped, scrubby and twisted, none thick enough to serve as cabin logs. She had a few dollars. She had one mule, one dog, one cast-iron pot, one knife, one hatchet, one coil of rope. She had a little flour and a small bag of salt. She had her husband's coat, which she had brought because she could not bear to leave it behind. She had a Bible she could not read without squinting, and a body that had worked hard for 55 years and was beginning to fail her in ways she could feel, but not yet see. Her knees ached when she stood. Her fingers were stiffening, curling inward at the knuckles. Her back protested movements that had once been effortless. She needed shelter, capable of holding warmth through a winter that could kill a man in a well-built cabin. She needed food for months. She needed water that would not freeze solid. She needed firewood, many cords of it, to burn through nights when the cold went deep enough to crack stone. She could not fell timber that did not exist. She could not carry logs she could not lift. She could not build a cabin without boards or nails or another pair of hands. She could not cut and split enough wood before winter, when her fingers already ached in the summer heat. The mathematics did not work. She knew it did not work. She had known it since Gunnar laid out her choices, and she chose the canyon anyway. She chose it because the alternative was worse than death. The alternative was becoming invisible while still breathing. The alternative was watching yourself disappear one meal at a time, one decision at a time, one small surrender at a time, until the woman who had built a life from nothing was nothing again. But this time, without the strength or the years to build it back. That first night, Astrid spread her blanket against the base of the south wall and lay down in the shade of a juniper. Flint curled against her side, his warmth familiar, the one constant left in a life that had lost its shape. The stone was warm against her back, almost hot. She could feel it through the blanket, through her dress, through the worn fabric of Irik's coat that she had folded into a pillow. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind would not stop counting. Roughly 3 months until the first hard freeze. 3 months to do the impossible. She woke in the darkest part of the night, shivering. The temperature had dropped sharply since sunset. The high desert gives its heat back to the sky with a cruelty that feels personal. And even in summer, the nights could turn cold enough to see your breath. Astrid pulled her blanket tighter and pressed her back against the cliff face. And then she stopped. The rock was warm. Not hot. Not like sitting beside a fire. But warm. Warmer than the air around her. Warmer than the ground beneath her blanket. Warmer than anything else in the canyon at this hour. She rolled over and placed her palm flat against the sandstone. She could feel it clearly now, the gentle heat radiating from the stone, heat that had been absorbed during the brutal day and was now being released slowly, steadily, generously, into the cooling night. And suddenly she was 9 years old again, standing in a mountain meadow in Norway, watching her father build. Tomas had been a stonemason all his life. His hands were rough and scarred, and permanently stained with stone dust, and he smelled like granite and sweat, and the particular mustiness of men who spend their days lifting things that are heavier than they are. He built walls and foundations, and the mountain huts where farmers lived during summer grazing season. Small, sturdy structures tucked into south-facing cliffs high in the mountains, where the wind could strip the warmth from a man's body in minutes. Astrid remembered helping him carry stones for one particular hut. She could barely lift them, but she carried them anyway, her small arms aching, her fingers scraped raw against the rough surfaces, wanting to help, wanting to understand, wanting her father to see that she was strong enough, even though she was a girl, and everyone said girls did not carry stones. "Why do we build into the cliff, Papa?" "Because the cliff is a stove," Tomas had told her. He spoke the way he built, carefully and without waste. Watch. The sun shines on the rock all day. The rock holds the heat. At night, when the cold comes, the rock gives the heat back. You do not need to burn wood. You burn the sun. She had not understood it then. She was a child, more interested in wildflowers than construction, more interested in the butterflies that drifted through the meadow grass than in the physics of heat retention. But she remembered the way that mountain hut had felt on autumn nights. the back wall warm to the touch while wind howled outside. Sleeping against that wall with her brothers, while her father fed only a tiny fire, barely more than coals, and the shelter stayed comfortable through the night. She remembered pressing her cheek against the stone and feeling the warmth move into her skin, into her bones, a warmth that did not crackle or flicker or threaten to go out, a warmth that was patient, that had been collecting all day and would spend all night giving back what it had gathered. The cliff is a stove. You burn the sun. Astrid sat up in the darkness of the canyon. Her heart was beating fast. Her mind was working through ideas she had not thought about in more than 40 years. Ideas that had been sleeping inside her like seeds buried under winter ground, waiting for the right combination of desperation and memory to break them open. A south-facing cliff. South-facing because the sun tracked across the southern sky, and a south-facing surface received the most hours of direct light. In summer, that meant many hours of heat beating against the rock. In winter, fewer hours, but the sun tracked lower, striking the cliff face more directly, more intensely. The rock absorbed heat. Sandstone was dense. Dense materials held heat longer, released it slower. A massive cliff face, thousands of tons of stone, could absorb heat for days and release it gradually through cold nights. A small space pressed against that cliff would receive radiated warmth without any fuel at all. The canyon walls blocked wind. Wind was the great thief, the thing that stripped heat from a body faster than cold alone. But down here on the canyon floor, protected by hundreds of feet of stone on every side, the wind could barely reach her. Astrid looked up at the cliff face towering above her in the darkness. She could not see it clearly, but she could feel it. She could feel the heat still bleeding from its surface hours after sunset, heat that would have been wasted on empty air if no one had been here to receive it. Heat that had been waiting, in some sense, for someone to build a wall and give it a reason to stay. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered. The stone said nothing back, but it was warm against her hand, and that was answer enough. By the time the sun crested the canyon rim the next morning, turning the sandstone from gray to gold to blazing orange, Astrid was already on her feet. She had not slept again after waking. She had spent the remaining hours of darkness sitting against the warm cliff, running calculations she had not made in 40 years, remembering things she did not know she still knew. Her father's voice in her ear, patient as stone, explaining principles she had been too young to understand and too old to forget. She had roughly 3 months. She had no timber, no nails, no mortar, no help, no experience in construction beyond the memories of a man who had been dead for more than 2 decades. She had a body that ached in places she could not name, and hands that had never stacked a wall in her life. But she had rock. She had miles of rock. She had a south-facing cliff that had been collecting heat from the sun since before any human being set foot in this canyon. A cliff that would go on collecting and releasing long after she was gone. And she had the memory of a man who had taught her that stone could be a stove, that sunlight could be fuel, that sometimes the oldest knowledge was not old at all, but simply patient, waiting in the back of a woman's mind for the moment when she would need it badly enough to hear it again. She bent to the nearest pile of sandstone rubble and selected a piece. It was heavy, roughly square, good for a corner. Her back protested when she lifted it. Her fingers complained against the rough surface. Her knees spoke in a language of clicks and warnings. She carried it to the base of the cliff and set it down. Then she went back for another. Josiah Cragg arrived on the third day. Astrid heard the hooves on stone before she saw him. She was kneeling beside a trickle of water she had found seeping from a crack in the cliff face, barely enough to fill her pot in an hour, when the sound reached her. She did not stand up. She knew who it would be before the horse came into view, because everyone in this territory knew Josiah Cragg. And when a widow made a decision that the community considered suicidal, Josiah was the one they sent to talk sense. He was 66 years old. He had arrived in this territory when Astrid was still a girl in Norway, before she had ever seen an ocean or imagined crossing one. He had buried 2 wives. He had buried 4 children, including a daughter who froze to death during a hard winter that people still talked about in low voices. He had built his cabin with hand-split timber at 35 and still cut his own firewood at 66, though it took him longer now, and his back screamed at him for days afterward. When new settlers arrived, Josiah was the one they came to for advice. When widows made foolish decisions, Josiah was the one the community sent to deliver the verdict. He dismounted slowly, the stiffness of age visible in every movement. He tied his gray gelding to a juniper branch. He walked toward Astrid with the careful assessment of a man who had seen many people die in this territory and could calculate the odds of survival the way another man might calculate the cost of lumber. His eyes moved across the canyon floor, across the scattered boulders, across the scrubby junipers, across the complete absence of anything resembling building material. His face settled into the expression of a man confirming what he already knew. Astrid, he said. Her name sounded like a diagnosis in his mouth. Josiah, your sons asked you to check on me. They did not come themselves. Gunnar has a farm to run. Tollef is far north at the railhead. Gunnar has always been busy when something uncomfortable needs doing. Josiah did not argue the point. He looked around the canyon one more time, slowly, thoroughly, the way a doctor examines a patient he already knows is dying. Astrid, I have buried friends who had more than you have. Men. Young men with strong backs and good axes and timber within hauling distance. He paused. His voice was not cruel. It was careful, which was worse. This canyon has no timber. A woman alone cannot build without timber. The ancient people built in canyons, Astrid said. She did not know why she said it. It had come to her during the night, a memory of something Eirik had told her about the ancient ones who had lived in cliff dwellings throughout this region. They did not use timber. Josiah's expression did not change. The ancient ones are gone, Astrid. All of them. Their ruins are empty. That should tell you something. It tells me they survived long enough to build ruins. Then they died. She finally stood, her knees aching, her back protesting. Everyone dies, Josiah. The question is how you live first. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Wind moved through the canyon, carrying the smell of sage and hot stone. How old are you, Astrid? 55. 55. He said it like a prison sentence, like the number itself was evidence against her. And you think you can build a shelter in this canyon? With no timber, no help, no experience in construction? I think I can try. Trying will not keep you warm when the deep cold comes. Neither will sitting in Gunner's spare room. Josiah shook his head, not in disagreement, in something closer to pity. The pity stung worse than disagreement would have. Pity was final. Pity meant the other person had already decided the outcome and was just waiting for reality to confirm it. A woman alone cannot build shelter from bare rock. He spoke carefully now, making sure each word landed. You will freeze, Astrid, and there will be no one to find your body until spring. The words hung in the air between them. A verdict delivered by a man who had earned the right to deliver it through decades of winter and loss. He knew what this land could do to people who were not prepared. He had dug graves in frozen ground. He had carried stiff bodies out of cabins where the fire had gone out in the night. He was not guessing. He was remembering. Then I will freeze, Astrid said. And you can tell Gunner he warned me. Josiah stared at her for a long moment. Then he untied his horse and mounted without another word. He rode up the trail and did not look back. Astrid watched him go. When the sound of hooves faded, she was alone again with the rock and the silence and the roughly 92 days she had left. She bent to the pile of sandstone rubble and selected another piece. The walls rose slowly, inch by inch, stone by stone. Astrid developed a routine in the days that followed. Wake at dawn, drink water from the seep, eat a handful of cornmeal paste, stretch until her back could bend, then work until her body refused to continue. She scavenged stones from increasingly distant parts of the canyon floor, dragging them on a crude sled she had fashioned from juniper branches lashed together with rope. The larger stones, 60 or 70 pounds, she could not lift directly. She learned to roll them onto the sled, drag the sled to the shelter site, then lever them into place using a juniper pole as a pry bar. It was brutally inefficient. What a young man could have done in a day took her a week. But she had no young man. She had only herself and Flint, who watched her work with patient brown eyes, occasionally rising to investigate a lizard or a sound in the brush, then returning to his spot by the growing wall to resume his vigil. Her body paid the price. The blisters on her hands broke and bled, and calloused over and broke again. Her shoulders ached from constant lifting. The stiffness in her fingers spread, curling her knuckles into painful angles that made gripping stone an act of will. She kept working. She built the way her father had taught her. A single course of stones fitted tightly together, leaning against the cliff face. Thin walls, direct contact with the rock behind. She remembered how Tomas had built the mountain huts in Norway, just a skin of stone against the cliff, enough to create a pocket of captured warmth. 2 weeks in, the walls stood 2 feet high. She was proud of them. Rough, uneven, unmortared, but standing. Hers. Then the first cool night of autumn arrived, and everything she had built was wrong. She felt it immediately. She had sealed herself inside the partial shelter, her back against the cliff, waiting for the warmth she remembered from those mountain huts. The cliff was warm. She could feel it radiating through the thin back wall, gentle and steady, the sun's gift returning as promised. But the warmth did not stay. It passed through the single-course front walls and side walls as easily as it passed through air. The heat moved from the cliff into the shelter, and then kept moving, right through the stones and out into the night, as if the walls were not there at all. By midnight, the shelter was barely warmer than the open canyon floor. The cliff was doing its job. The walls were not doing theirs. They were too thin to hold anything. They were letting the heat escape as fast as the cliff could provide it. Astrid sat in the darkness, her arms wrapped around her knees, and understood. Her father's technique worked in Norway because the mountain valleys were gentler. The winters were harsh, but not lethal in the way this high desert was lethal. A single-course wall was enough to capture the cliff's warmth when the temperature outside dropped to 10 or 15 below freezing. But here, where the winter cold could plunge far deeper, where the air was drier and the wind sharper and the nights lasted 14 hours, a thin wall was no wall at all. The warmth would bleed through it like water through a sieve. Her father's knowledge was not wrong. It was incomplete. It was the answer to a different question, asked in a different place, under different stars. And she was asking a question her father had never faced. For a long time she sat still. The cliff behind her was warm. The air around her was cold and getting colder. The gap between those two facts was the distance between survival and death, and she was sitting in it. She thought about Gunnar's spare room, about warmth she did not earn, about food she did not cook, about the slow, comfortable suffocation of being taken care of by people who wished she would take up less space. Then she thought about walls. A single wall let heat through. What if there were two walls? Two layers of stone with a gap between them. The gap could be filled with sand, with gravel, with the loose rubble that covered the canyon floor. Sand was a poor conductor. It would slow the transfer of heat. The warmth from the cliff would enter the shelter through the thin back wall, and the thick double front wall would trap it inside. The heat would have nowhere to go. Insulation. That was the word. She did not know the word, had never heard it used in this context, but she understood the principle. She understood it the way she understood that a wool coat kept you warmer than a cotton one, not because wool created heat, but because it held heat in, trapped it, refused to let it leave. She would have to tear down the front wall. She would have to tear down the side walls. 2 weeks of labor, hundreds of stones lifted and placed and now wasted. She would have to start those walls over, building them twice as thick, twice as heavy, twice as slow. And she had already lost 2 weeks she could not afford to lose. The ticking clock in her head adjusted. Not 92 days anymore, 78. 78 days to rebuild what she had gotten wrong and finish what she had not yet started. The roof, the door, the ceiling. She pressed her palms against the warm cliff and closed her eyes. She could tear it down in the morning. She could start again. She could build it right this time, better than her father had built, because she was answering a harder question than her father had ever been asked. Or she could leave. She could climb the trail at dawn and walk to town and accept that every person who had told her she would fail had been right. She opened her eyes. The cliff was warm against her hands. In the morning, she began taking the front wall apart. The second version of the walls took longer. Everything took longer. She was building double-coursed now, 2 rows of stone with a hand-width gap between them. She filled the gaps with sand and crushed rubble packed tight, tamping it down with a flat stone until it was dense and solid. The front wall and side walls grew thick and heavy. The back wall she kept thin, a single course, almost a membrane, so the cliff's warmth could pass through easily. It was during this rebuilding that Asa Kirkwood appeared. He was 48 years old, a carpenter who had built more structures in this territory than he could count. He had heard about the Norwegian widow's madness and decided to see for himself. Astrid was stacking stones when he appeared at the edge of her excavation. The walls were rising again, thicker than before, double-coursed and heavy. Kirkwood looked at the structure. He looked at the pile of stones. He looked at the old woman with bleeding hands and a face streaked with red dust. No mortar, he said. No frame. No real roof to speak of. He shook his head. That is not a house, Mrs. Ingen. That is a pile of rocks. A child would know that. Astrid did not stop working. She was getting used to visitors who came to pronounce her dead. She was beginning to think of them as weather. They arrived, they delivered their forecast, they left. I am not building a house, she said. Then what are you building? A shelter. A house needs fire to stay warm. Rooms, windows, a chimney, cords and cords of wood. She straightened up and met his eyes for the first time. A shelter is small, just enough space to survive. If the space is small enough and the heat source is steady enough, you do not need fire at all. Heat source. Kirkwood looked around the canyon as if searching for a stove she might have hidden somewhere. What heat source? You have no stove. Astrid pointed at the cliff face behind her. Hundreds of feet of sandstone glowing rust orange in the afternoon sun. That, she said, that is my stove. The carpenter stared at the cliff, then at her, then at the cliff again. His laughter was sudden and sharp, the kind of laughter that is less about amusement and more about the discomfort of encountering something you cannot categorize. The rock, he said. You think the rock will heat your shelter? My father built this way in Norway. He called it burning the sun. Your father. Kirkwood's voice dripped with the particular condescension of a man who has been doing something one way for 25 years and cannot imagine that another way might exist. Norwegian techniques. Against a cliff face that will be buried in snow by winter. The cliff face is south-facing. Snow will not accumulate on a surface that receives direct sun, even in winter. And the thermal mass of hundreds of feet of sandstone holds more heat than any stove you have ever built. For a moment, something flickered in Kirkwood's eyes. Doubt, perhaps. Or the beginning of curiosity, quickly smothered by professional pride. He had built houses for a quarter century. He knew what worked and what did not work. What this woman was building, with her bleeding hands and her dead husband's coat folded on a rock and her old dog watching from the shade, was not something he recognized. And things he did not recognize made him uncomfortable, and discomfort made him mean. What you are building, he said, gesturing at the walls and the cliff and the canyon around them, is your own coffin. He turned and walked back up the trail without another word. Flint growled as the carpenter passed, a low sound, barely audible, but enough to make the man's steps quickened slightly. "Good boy," Astrid said to the dog after Kirkwood had disappeared over the rim. "Good boy." Reverend Hiram Poole came during the third week, Bible in hand, white collar bright against the Red Canyon walls. He had heard that the Norwegian widow was relying on old ways, techniques that predated Christianity, and he wanted her to know that God did not approve of heathen superstitions. Astrid did not stop mixing clay. "Reverend Poole," she said, "my husband is dead. My sons have taken my land. I have been given a few dozen acres of rock and told to survive or die. I will use every tool I have: physics, memory, faith, stubbornness. If God objects to my methods, he is welcome to provide better ones." Poole left muttering about pride and the dangers of a stiff-necked woman. But not everyone came to criticize. Old Harlan Birch arrived on a morning when the walls were 3 feet high and the double-coursed sections were beginning to look like something intentional rather than accidental. He was 78 years old, a retired trapper who had spent decades in the mountains before settling in the valley. He walked with a cane carved from elk antler, and his eyes, though rheumy with age, missed nothing. He did not speak when he reached the shelter. He simply walked to the cliff face, placed his palm flat against the warm stone, and stood there for a long time. His hand rested on the rock the way you might rest your hand on the shoulder of an old friend. His eyes were closed. He was feeling something, measuring something, remembering something. Finally, he nodded. "My grandfather built a root cellar into a hillside," he said. His voice was quiet, the voice of a man who had learned that the most important things are usually said softly. Dug it right into the slope, faced it south. He said the earth held heat. He said you could keep food from freezing all winter if you built it right. Astrid set down the stone she was carrying. Did it work? Worked fine. Kept apples good past the worst of winter. Potatoes even longer. Harlan turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that she had not seen from anyone else who had come to this canyon. Respect. Not the respect of someone who thought she would succeed, the respect of someone who recognized what she was doing and understood where it came from. "I do not know if this will work, Mrs. Engen. This territory is not the place my grandfather knew, and rock is not dirt. But you are not crazy. You are remembering." He paused. Then he said something that would save her life, though neither of them knew it yet. "One thing my grandfather learned the hard way." He tapped his cane against the ground. "Dig a trench around your foundation, narrow and deep. Rain is the quiet enemy, not the cold. Rain gets into gaps, freezes, expands, cracks everything apart. Most people worry about the storm they can see. It is the water they do not see that kills the foundation." He touched his hat brim and walked away. Astrid watched him go, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt something like hope. Not certainty, not confidence, just the small, warm sensation of being seen by someone who understood. The news came through Marta Strand. Marta was 43, a Norwegian immigrant like Astrid, widowed 5 years earlier, and running a general store in town with the help of her 2 sons. She arrived at the canyon on an autumn afternoon, carrying a basket covered with cloth. Astrid. She dismounted and tied her horse, then stood looking at the shelter with an expression of mingled concern and fascination. I brought food: bread, cheese, dried apples, cornmeal, enough to stretch a few weeks if you are careful. Thank you. Astrid did not stop working. She had learned that stopping made it harder to start again. Her body had reached an understanding with labor. As long as she kept moving, the pain stayed manageable. The moment she sat down, everything ceased. Marta watched her for a moment. They are calling you mad, you know, in town. The merchant wives say you have lost your mind from grief. The Norwegian families are embarrassed. They say you make them look foolish. I am not trying to represent anyone. The minister says you are relying on heathen superstitions. Asa Kirkwood has told everyone you are building your own grave. Astrid fitted a stone into place and straightened up. Is there anything else? Marta hesitated. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. There is this, Gunnar spoke at the trading post. In front of a crowd, he said. She looked down at the paper, though Astrid suspected she had memorized the words. He said that you are no longer his mother, that if anyone finds your body, they should bury you where you lie, because he will not pay for transport. The words hung in the canyon air. They echoed off the sandstone walls the way all words echoed here, bouncing and multiplying and fading slowly, as if the rock were trying to absorb them the way it absorbed heat, taking them in and holding them, and releasing them later when no one was listening. Astrid stood very still. She thought about Gunnar as a boy, running through the fields she and Eric had cleared, laughing, tumbling, always wanting to help his father with the chores. Bringing her wildflowers in his small fist, the stems crushed from gripping too hard, because he had not yet learned that some things required gentleness. She thought about the young man he had become, ambitious and hard, so certain he knew the right way to do everything that he could not see any other way at all. She thought about the word mother, and what it meant to hear your child say you were no longer that. As if the word were a title that could be revoked. As if the act of carrying a life inside your body for 9 months and then spending 34 years keeping it alive could be undone by a sentence spoken in a trading post to impress people who did not matter. Is that all? Her voice was steady. There was one more thing. Marta folded the paper carefully. Someone at the saloon started taking bets. Several people wagered you would die before the winter holiday. No one bet that you would live. Astrid was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was not happy laughter. It was the laugh of exhaustion and absurdity, the kind that comes when things have gotten so bad that the only response left is to recognize the joke. Well, she said, at least I will not have to hear Gunnar speak at my funeral. Marta did not laugh. Astrid, this is serious. If you die here, if I die here, I die here. It will be my death, on my land, by my choice. That is more than most people get. She picked up another stone, but Marta was not finished. There is something else Gunnar has done. Marta's voice dropped. He visited my store last week. He told me that if I continued helping you, he would take his business elsewhere and encourage others to do the same. He said associating with... She paused, choosing her words carefully. He said associating with your madness would make people question my judgment, and people who question a shopkeeper's judgment stop buying from her. Astrid set the stone down. She looked at Marta with an expression that was equal parts anger and sorrow. Anger at her son for extending his cruelty beyond her and on to the one person who had shown her kindness. Sorrow at recognizing that the boy who used to bring her wildflowers had become a man who used threats the way other men used hammers. "There is one more thing," Marta said, her voice softer now. "3 days ago, I found a sack of cornmeal at the top of the canyon trail. No note, no name, just a scrap of paper tucked under the drawstring with one word written on it." She paused. "Sorry," in Tollef's handwriting. Astrid was quiet for a long time. Her younger son, the one who had opened his mouth at the kitchen table and closed it again. The one who had touched her shoulder and followed his brother out. He could not stand beside her in the open. He did not have that kind of courage. But he had climbed a trail in the dark and left what he could carry and written the only word he could afford to say. It was not enough. It was also everything he had. She did not mention it again. "Marta, you do not owe me anything. If helping me puts your livelihood at risk..." "I did not come here to tell you I am stopping," Marta said. Her voice had changed. Something had hardened in it, the way clay hardens in the sun, the way a decision hardens when it stops being a thought and becomes a commitment. "I came to tell you what he said, and to tell you that I still think you are mad. But I will not watch you die because you cannot lift a roof pole." She paused. "My sons, Sindre and Vigo, they are 17 and 15, strong boys. I will send them tomorrow to help with whatever you cannot do alone." Astrid felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not relief exactly. Something closer to the feeling of discovering that you are not the only person in the world who thinks the way you think. That somewhere out there, at least one other person looked at the same situation and made the same impossible choice. "I cannot pay you," Astrid said. "I did not ask for payment." "Then what do you want?" Marta smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I want you to prove me wrong. I want you to build this shelter and survive this winter and make Josiah Cragg eat his words." She paused. "And if you do not, if you freeze anyway, at least I will know I tried." Sindre and Vigo Strand arrived at dawn the next day. They came down the canyon trail on foot, leading a mule loaded with tools. A crosscut saw, a coil of heavy rope, 2 iron spikes that could be driven into rock. They were tall boys, both of them, with their father's broad shoulders and their mother's careful eyes. Sindre, the elder, spoke first. "Mother says you need help with poles." "I do." "She says you are building a shelter against the cliff." "I am." "She says the cliff will heat it." "It will." The boys exchanged a glance. Vigo, 15, quieter and more observant than his brother, looked up at the cliff face towering above them. The morning sun had just crested the canyon rim, and the first rays were striking the sandstone, turning it from gray to gold to blazing orange. "How?" Vigo asked. It was the first time anyone had asked her to explain, not to justify, not to defend, to explain. The difference was everything. Astrid set down the stone she was holding and walked to the shelter wall. She placed her palm flat against the cliff face inside the structure. "Feel this," she said. Vigo stepped into the shelter and touched the rock. His eyes widened. It is warm. It is autumn. The nights are cold now, but the rock is warm. All day yesterday, this cliff absorbed heat from the sun. Stone holds heat longer than air, much longer. When the temperature dropped last night, the cliff kept releasing what it had stored. She tapped the rock. This wall is not just a wall. It is a stove that burns sunlight. Sindre had come closer to listen. He touched the cliff face and pulled his hand back as if surprised. But it is autumn, he said. The sun is weaker now. In the deep of winter. In winter, the sun will be weaker still. The cliff will hold less heat. But it will hold some. Astrid gestured at the stone walls around them. My job is to trap whatever heat the cliff provides. Small space, thick walls, no gaps for cold air to enter. If I do it right, the shelter will stay above freezing even when the outside temperature drops far below it. If you do it right, Vigo repeated. Yes, if. The boys looked at each other again. Some communication passed between them. The wordless language of siblings who had worked together their whole lives. Show us the poles, Sindre said. The first pole came down in 2 hours. The boys had brought the crosscut saw, but the real challenge was transportation. 60 pounds of green juniper, 8 feet long, on a steep slope covered in loose scree. Astrid had nearly killed herself trying to drag a pole alone. The boys made it look almost easy. They worked in tandem, one at each end, moving in coordinated steps, calling out warnings when the footing turned treacherous. By noon, 3 poles lay at the base of the shelter. By sunset, all 8 were down. The boys stayed for dinner. Cornmeal paste, which they ate without complaint, sitting on flat rocks near the shelter entrance while the last light drained from the canyon. Then they slept in the shelter that night, their backs against the warm cliff. Vigo woke in the middle of the night and touched the stone again. Astrid, lying nearby, heard him whisper to his brother, "It is still warm." Hours after dark. Like the brick ovens the bakers use. They keep the ovens warm all night, so the bread is ready by morning. Go to sleep, Sindre muttered. But it works. What she said about burning the sun. It actually works. In the darkness, Astrid smiled. Flint, who was curled between her and the boys, thumped his tail once against the stone floor. He could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Something had shifted. The shelter was no longer just hers. It had begun to belong to the people who believed in it. But Marta and Astrid did not agree on everything. When Marta came to inspect the progress 2 days later, she stood inside the shelter and looked up at the poles laid across the top, like the ribs of some great creature. The roof needs to be steeper, she said. A flat roof will collect snow. The weight will collapse it. Astrid shook her head. A steep roof sheds snow, but it also sheds the earth I need to pile on top for insulation. The earth is what keeps the heat inside. Without it, the roof is just poles and brush. Useless. A flat roof with 2 feet of wet snow on it is a death trap. Marta's voice was firm. I have seen roofs collapse under less. And I have seen shelters lose all their warmth through a bare roof. The earth stays. The slope stays gentle. Marta crossed her arms. You are being stubborn. I am being right. They stared at each other. Two women who respected each other enough to disagree without softening it. Two widows who had each learned that survival sometimes meant refusing to yield, even to the people you trusted most, even when the person you were refusing was trying to save your life. The argument did not resolve that day, or the next. It sat between them like a stone neither would move, and they worked around it the way you work around any obstacle that is too heavy to lift, but too important to ignore. The rains came in the middle of autumn. Astrid woke one morning to the sound of water hitting canvas, the crude covering she had rigged as temporary protection over the unfinished roof. The rain was light but steady, and it continued for 4 days. The earth she had already spread over the roof poles turned to mud. Water found its way through every gap. It pooled on the shelter floor. It softened the clay she had used to seal the walls. It threatened to undo weeks of work in a matter of hours. Astrid huddled inside, wrapped in Eirik's coat, watching water drip through her unfinished roof. And for the first time since entering the canyon, she seriously considered giving up. She could climb the trail, walk to Marta's house, accept charity, survive the winter in someone else's root cellar, eating someone else's food, owing a debt she could never repay. She would live. She would hate every moment of it. But she would live. The rain kept falling. The temperature kept dropping. On the 4th night, Astrid sat with her back against the cliff and spoke aloud to the darkness. "I cannot do this." No one answered. The rain did not care about her exhaustion. The cold did not care about her courage. The canyon wall stood indifferent and ancient around her, having witnessed 10,000 storms and 10,000 failures, and not a single miracle that was not earned through labor. "I cannot do this alone." Still nothing. She pulled Eirik's coat tighter around her shoulders and breathed in the fading smell of pipe tobacco and lanolin. The smell was almost gone now, worn away by weeks of use, by sweat and dust, and the endless work of staying alive. Soon the coat would smell like nothing, like any coat. And that would be another small death added to the large one she was still carrying. And then, quietly, in the silence between raindrops, she heard her father's voice. "Stone does not care about rain, Astrid. It was not real." She knew it was not real. Tomas had been dead for more than 2 decades. But she heard him anyway. The voice of a man who had spent his life building things that lasted, speaking to a daughter who was trying to do the same. Stone does not care about cold. Stone has been holding heat since before humans walked this land. You only need to give it a place to share. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the rain was still falling. Her body still hurt. Her situation was still impossible. But she was still here, still breathing, still able to move her hands, however stiff they had become. And then she remembered what Harlan Birch had told her. The quiet enemy. Rain gets into gaps, freezes, expands, cracks everything apart. Dig a trench around your foundation. She had not done it. She had been so focused on the walls, on the roof poles, on the arguments with Marta about pitch and slope, that she had forgotten the simplest piece of advice anyone had given her. The water pooling on her floor was not just an inconvenience, it was a preview. When winter came, that water would freeze inside the walls. It would expand. It would crack the clay seals apart from the inside. It would destroy her shelter, not with a single blow, but with 1,000 tiny ones. The patient work of ice in stone, invisible until it was too late. She picked up her flat digging stone and began scraping a trench around the base of the shelter. In the rain, in the dark, in the cold. The trench was narrow and shallow, but angled away from the foundation, so water flowed out instead of pooling in. It was not elegant. It was not even particularly effective, but it was something. And something was the difference between giving up and going on. The roof was finished 3 days after the rain stopped. 950 pounds of earth packed over a layer of brush, supported by 8 juniper poles braced against the cliff. The surface was uneven. She had no tools to smooth it, but it was solid. When she climbed on top to check for gaps, it held her weight without creaking. From outside, the shelter looked like a wound in the canyon wall. A dark rectangle of stacked stone, roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep, tucked into a natural alcove. A dirt-covered roof that sloped gently away from the cliff. The front wall rose about 5 feet, the back merged with the sandstone. The whole thing crouched against the rock, like an animal seeking warmth from a larger body. It was ugly. It was primitive. It looked nothing like the neat frame houses and log cabins that proper settlers built. But it was finished, and the double walls were thick, and the back wall was thin, and the cliff behind it was warm. Astrid spent the next several days sealing gaps with clay. Red clay from near the Seep Spring, thick and sticky, mixed with sand and small stones. She packed it into every crack between stones, smoothed it over rough edges, built up layers where the gaps were wide. Her fingers went numb within minutes of starting each morning, and she had to stop frequently to press her hands against the cliff until the feeling returned. On the night when the ceiling was complete, she slept in the finished shelter for the first time with the door closed. The temperature outside dropped well below freezing. Inside the shelter, pressed against the cliff face, it was cold but not bitter, not dangerous. The rock at her back held steady. The thick double walls kept the heat inside. Flint's body provided a few more degrees. She slept better than she had in months. Josiah Cragg returned a few days later. He came down the trail slowly, his gray gelding picking its way over rocks that had grown slick with frost. The canyon was colder now, daytime temperatures barely above freezing, nights dropping well below. Astrid was outside patching a section of roof where the earth had settled and opened a gap. She did not stop working when she heard the hooves. Astrid, Josiah, you are still alive. I am. I did not expect that. I know. He walked to the shelter and stood at the entrance, examining the walls, the roof, the door made of juniper branches woven with strips of deer hide. His expression was unreadable. He stepped inside. The space was too small for him to stand fully upright, but he could crouch comfortably. He pressed his back against the cliff face. He closed his eyes and stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly. When he opened his eyes, something in his face had changed. Not much. Josiah Cragg was not a man whose face changed easily, but something. "It is warm," he said finally. "Warmer than my cabin was last night, and I had a fire burning. Yes, the sun has been down for hours. I know." He pulled his hand from the cliff face and looked at her. The pity was gone from his eyes. In its place was something more complicated, something that had elements of curiosity and respect, and the particular discomfort of a man who is being forced to reconsider a certainty he has held for a very long time. "This might work," he said. Astrid felt something loosen in her chest. Not triumph, not yet, but something. Might is not will. No. Josiah ducked back out of the shelter and stood in the fading light. The real cold has not come yet. The deep winter is the killer. The storms that drop temperatures faster than you can believe. The cold that settles in and does not leave for weeks. He looked at her. This shelter might hold through moderate cold. But if the worst comes, then I die. Then you die. I know the risks, Josiah. Do you? His voice was not unkind, but it was direct. Do you know that 2 winters ago, a man froze to death in a cabin with a stone fireplace and 3 cords of wood? His fire went out in the night, and he was too cold to wake up and relight it. They found him in his bed. He looked like he was sleeping. I know. Do you know that the old-timers are talking? His voice dropped. The signs are bad. Cattle growing thick coats early. Birds leaving before they should. Something is coming, Astrid. Something worse than usual. I know. She met his eyes. That is why I built this. Josiah stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he shook his head. Not in disagreement, in something like wonder. The kind of wonder that comes when you encounter a thing you cannot explain with the tools you have always used to explain the world. You are either the bravest woman in this territory, he said, or the most foolish. Perhaps both. He almost smiled. Perhaps. He mounted his horse and rode up the trail. At the rim, he paused and looked back down at the shelter, crouched against the cliff face in the gathering dark. I will come again when the deep cold hits, he called down, if you are still alive. I will be, she said. We will see. The shelter was complete. 3 months of labor, hundreds of stones, thousands of pounds moved by hand, a failure discovered and corrected, a trench dug in the rain on a night when giving up would have been easier than going on, double walls that trapped heat, a thin back wall that let it in, a roof of earth and brush that held. But the real question remained unanswered. Would the stone remember enough warmth? Would the sun's heat, stored through the short winter days and long cold nights, be enough to keep one woman and one old dog alive when the deep cold came? Astrid had bet her life on physics and memory, on lessons learned from her father in a country she would never see again, on the simple truth that sometimes the old ways were not old at all. They were just waiting to be remembered. The answer would come with the winter. Winter arrived the way a predator arrives, not all at once, not with a roar, but with a slow tightening, a gradual constriction of light and warmth and possibility, Until one morning, Astrid woke and realized that the world outside her shelter had become a different place entirely. The first hard freeze came without warning. She woke to find frost on the inside of her door, delicate patterns of white crystals spreading across the juniper branches like lace made by hands too small to see. Flint was pressed tight against her side, his old body curled into the smallest shape it could manage, his nose tucked under his tail. But the cliff held, just as Josiah had felt, just as Astrid had promised. The stone gave back what the sun had left, and the double walls refused to let it go, and the shelter stayed above the killing line. Not comfortable, but alive. The days compressed into a rhythm that was less like living and more like enduring. Wake in darkness. Drink snowmelt from the pot she kept near the cliff face where the stone's heat prevented freezing. Eat a small portion of cornmeal, carefully rationed, always less than hunger demanded, because the supplies had to last, and there was no way to get more. Venture outside to check the walls for new cracks, the roof for settling, the drainage trench for ice blockage. Repair what needed repairing with fingers that went numb within minutes and had to be pressed against the cliff between every task. Then back inside, seal the door, sit against the stone. Wait. The waiting was the hardest part, not the cold, not the hunger, not the aching joints or the stiffening fingers or the eyes that could no longer read in dim light. The waiting. The sheer, relentless duration of winter darkness. 14 hours of night stretching out like a road with no destination, no landmarks, no way to measure progress except the slow rotation of stars she could not see through the roof above her head. Astrid talked to Flint. Long conversations conducted in a soft voice that the dog could not understand, but responded to anyway, his tail thumping weakly against the stone floor at the sound of her words, his cloudy eyes fixed on her face with an attention that never wavered. She told him about Norway, about the mountain meadows where she had played as a child, about the fjords that cut into the coast like wounds in the earth, about the light in summer that never fully died, that lingered on the horizon like a guest who could not bring himself to leave. She told him about Eirik, about the day they met, about his hands, which were always rough and always gentle, which could split a log with an axe and then thread a needle to mend a tear in a child's shirt. She told him about the early years on this plateau, when everything was hard and nothing was certain, and the only thing they had in abundance was each other. Flint listened. He could not understand the words, but he understood the voice. He understood that the person he had chosen to love was lonely and frightened and tired in a way that went deeper than muscle and bone, and that the only medicine he could offer was his presence, his warmth, the steady rhythm of his breathing in the darkness. Some nights, Astrid woke to find Flint whimpering in his sleep, his old body twitching, his legs moving in the phantom runs of dreams. She would place her hand on his side and feel his ribs beneath the thinning fur, each one more prominent than it had been a month ago, and she would stroke him gently until the whimpering stopped. He was old, older than any dog she had known, and winter was hard on old things, on old bones and old joints and old hearts that had been beating faithfully for so many years and were beginning to tire of the work. She held him closer on those nights, and pressed them both against the cliff that still carried the sun's memory, and waited for morning. The bread was gone before the solstice. The dried apples were gone soon after. She was down to cornmeal and occasional handfuls of pine nuts she had gathered from scattered trees above the canyon rim in the weeks before the snow made climbing too dangerous. The pine nuts were small and bitter and required more effort to shell than they provided in nourishment, but they were something, and something was everything. She was thin, thinner than she had been in decades. Her dress hung loose on her frame like a garment made for someone larger, someone who had existed before all of this began. Her face in the reflection of her water pot was gaunt and hollowed, the cheekbones sharp, the eyes deeper in their sockets than she remembered. She looked like a woman made of wire and leather and stubbornness. Everything soft, burned away by the slow fire of survival. Everything left behind, essential and hard and unwilling to quit. The holiday came and went without ceremony. Astrid spent it alone in her shelter, eating cornmeal paste and thinking about Eric, about their first celebration of the season in this country, when they had nothing but each other and a single candle, and a belief that things would get better. About the last one before he died, when he had given her a shawl he had saved for months to afford, and she had cried because she knew he could not afford it, and because the giving of it was so purely him, so completely the man she had married, that the shawl was not just wool and thread, but a distillation of 33 years of being known by someone who paid attention. She missed him. She missed him every day. But she missed him most on days when the silence was too loud and the cold was too present, and there was no one to share the burden of simply being alive. Flint lay beside her, his old body pressed against her legs, his tail giving an occasional thump when she stroked his ears. "Happy holiday," she said to the dog. He licked her hand. "Happy holiday," she said to the cliff. The cliff said nothing, but it was warm against her back, and that was answer enough. The new year arrived with ice. Everything glittered. Every surface shone. Every branch was weighted with frozen mist. Inside the shelter, the cliff still carried yesterday's sun. The differential between inside and outside had grown larger as the winter deepened. The colder it got outside, the more dramatic the difference felt. The shelter was not comfortable by any standard, but it was enough. Enough to keep water liquid near the cliff face. Enough to keep fingers from blackening. Enough to sustain the small, stubborn flame of a body that refused to go out. The storms that followed came in waves, not blizzards yet, but steady snowfall that accumulated on the mesa above and drifted into the canyon in white curtains. The trail up to the rim became impassable. Astrid was trapped. She did not mind. She had prepared for this. She had food enough for another month if she rationed carefully. She had water. Snow melted slowly in her pot near the cliff face, where the stone's heat kept it from freezing solid. She had shelter, and she had the stone, and she had Flint. The deep cold came at the beginning of the year's first month. The day began clear, so clear it hurt. The sky was a blue so deep and so absolute that it seemed less like a color and more like the absence of everything that was not blue. A void that went all the way to the stars and did not stop. The sun rose late and hung low and weak, barely clearing the canyon rim before beginning its retreat. But even weak, even low, even brief, it found the south-facing cliff. It always found the cliff. That was the deal the stone had made with the sun 10,000 years ago, and neither party had ever broken it. Astrid emerged from the shelter that morning and stood in the cold sunlight. She checked her walls. The clay had cracked in several places overnight. The freeze-thaw cycle was relentless, water seeping into tiny gaps, freezing, expanding, splitting the packed mud apart. She spent 2 hours repacking the cracks, her fingers going numb almost immediately, pressing her hands against the cliff every few minutes to restore feeling. The work was endless. It would always be endless. For as long as winter lasted, the cold would attack and she would repair, and neither of them would stop. By noon, the repairs were done. She ate a small meal and climbed to a ledge above the shelter where she could see down the length of the canyon. Nothing moved. The snow lay undisturbed. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own blood moving in her ears. She looked up at the sky. The blue was fading. Not to gray, not yet, but to something paler, something washed out, something that had a quality she did not like. A heaviness, a weight, as if the sky were filling with something invisible, something gathering itself in the upper reaches of the atmosphere, like a hand drawing back before a strike. The air felt different, charged, the way air feels before something enormous happens, before lightning splits a tree, or a river breaks its banks, or the earth opens up and swallows what was standing on it a moment before. She had lived through enough winters to know what that feeling meant. Flint was pacing when she returned to the shelter. He would not settle. He kept walking in tight circles, kept looking up at the sky and whimpering, kept pressing his body against her legs and then pulling away and circling again. Animals knew things. They felt changes in pressure that human skin could not detect. They sensed shifts in the electromagnetic field that human nerves were too crude to register. Whatever was coming, Flint could feel it in his bones, the way Astrid could feel the cliff's warmth in hers. "I know," Astrid said. "I feel it too." She gathered extra brush from the slopes, enough for many days of small fires if she needed them. She melted snow and filled every container she had with water. She checked the door, checked the walls, checked the roof, ran her fingers along every seam and seal and junction, feeling for gaps, for weaknesses, for the places where the cold might find its way in. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron. By sunset, the wind had begun to rise. The temperature dropped through the afternoon, then through the evening, and kept dropping. Mid-afternoon, it was chilly. By dark, it was bitter. By the time Astrid sealed herself inside the shelter and pressed her back against the cliff, the cold outside had become something she had never felt before. Not weather, something older. Something that preceded weather, that existed before anyone had given names to the seasons or invented instruments to measure their cruelty. She sealed the door covering tight and waited. The storm hit in the deep middle of the night. Astrid was dozing against the cliff when she heard it. A sound like nothing she had ever experienced. Not wind. Not a storm as she understood storms. Something deeper. Something that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the bedrock beneath the canyon floor. a vibration as much as a sound, a resonance that she felt in her sternum and her jawbone and the soles of her feet. She pressed her back harder against the stone and listened. The canyon walls were doing their work. She could hear the storm raging somewhere above, up on the mesa where there was nothing between the wind and the ground but a few hundred miles of open territory. The howl of it, the crack of breaking branches, the strange keening sound of snow being driven sideways across flat ground at speeds that could strip skin. But down here, behind hundreds of feet of sandstone, the sound was muffled, distant, as if the storm were happening in another country and she were hearing it through a wall of water. Inside the shelter, the air barely moved. The door covering strained against its lashings, bulging inward with each gust that found its way down to the canyon floor. But it held. The walls held. The roof held. The temperature dropped, and kept dropping, and kept dropping. By the early hours of the morning, the cold had reached a depth Astrid had not imagined possible. The air inside the shelter, which had been cold but bearable at nightfall, was now approaching the edge of danger. She could feel it in the way her breath came shorter, in the way her fingers refused to straighten, in the way Flint had stopped moving entirely and was pressed against her with a desperation that was less about affection and more about survival. But the cliff at her back still held its heat, still radiating what it had been absorbing for days, for weeks, for all the autumn afternoons when the sun had beaten against the sandstone and the stone had taken it in and refused to let go. The thermal mass was so great, so enormous, so ancient in its patience, that even this unprecedented cold could not drain it completely. The stone was giving back what it had gathered, slowly, steadily, the way it had been giving for 10,000 years before Astrid was born, and would continue giving for 10,000 years after she was gone. She pressed her palms flat against the rock and whispered a thank you that was also a prayer. Outside, the storm tore at the world. Inside, Astrid survived. The sound came just after 3 in the morning. A scraping, a thump, the shuffle of something moving outside the door. Not the random violence of wind throwing debris. Something deliberate, something with intention. Astrid went rigid. She reached for her hatchet, the same one she had used to shape juniper poles and split kindling and pry stones loose from frozen ground. She gripped it in hands that were stiff with cold and age and adrenaline, and waited. The door covering moved. A hand appeared at the edge. Brown skin, fingers blue with cold, nails cracked and bleeding. A human hand, reaching through the gap between the hide and the stone frame with the desperate, clumsy groping of someone who has very little time left. The hand pulled the covering aside, and a face appeared. A girl, young, perhaps 19, perhaps younger. It was hard to tell through the mask of ice and exhaustion and suffering that the storm had pressed onto her features. Black hair matted with snow, skin the color of canyon walls at sunset, eyes so dark they seemed to absorb what little light existed inside the shelter rather than reflecting it. She was shaking, her whole body convulsing with cold, a shaking that went deeper than muscle, that started in the core and radiated outward, as if the cold had gotten inside her and was now shaking her apart from the inside out. When she opened her mouth to speak, no sound came. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were glassy. She was dying, and she knew she was dying, and the knowledge was visible in her face alongside the determination to not die, to fight it, to reach through one more doorway and find one more source of warmth before the cold took the last of what she had. Astrid made her decision in less than a second. "Inside," she said, reaching for the girl's arm. "Now. Inside." The girl did not understand the words, but she understood the hands that gripped her arms. She understood the strength in them, surprising strength, the strength of a woman who had been lifting stones for 3 months. She understood the warmth that flowed from those hands into her frozen skin. She crawled through the doorway and collapsed on the floor of the shelter, still shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps that were barely breathing at all. Flint was there already. The old dog pressed his body against the stranger without hesitation, without question, without any consideration beyond the simple calculus that this person was cold and he was warm, and the space between those two things needed to be closed. He licked her frozen hands. His tail thumped weakly against the stone. Astrid sealed the door and turned to assess the situation. One shelter, 48 square feet. Barely room for one person to sleep comfortably, let alone 2. One pile of blankets, one warm cliff, one set of dwindling food supplies. One stranger who would die without help. "Against the wall," she said, pointing to the cliff face. "The rock is warm. Press your back against it." The girl stared blankly. Astrid took her by the shoulders. The girl was light, far too light. Nothing but bone and cold stiffened muscle and the fading remnants of a body that had been strong before the storm broke it down. Astrid guided her to the back of the shelter and pressed her against the cliff. She wrapped her in the only spare blanket. She positioned Flint on one side and herself on the other, sandwiching the girl between 2 sources of warmth and the stone wall that was the third. Then she built a fire. The first fire she had built inside the shelter since finishing it. The first use of her emergency fuel supply. She had been saving it. She had been afraid to use it, afraid that once she started burning, she would not be able to stop, that the fuel would run out, and the habit of warmth would make the cold afterward even harder to bear. But this girl was dying. And there are moments when saving what you have matters less than spending it on the thing that needs it most. The brush caught quickly. The smoke had nowhere to go except out through the gaps around the door. And within minutes, the interior was hazy and acrid, stinging Astrid's eyes and throat. But the temperature rose. The fire and the cliff and the 3 bodies sharing a small space. The air thickened with heat. The girl stopped shaking. Not all at once. The convulsions slowed, then weakened, then became a steady trembling, then became occasional shivers, then became stillness. Her color began to return, first to her lips, the blue fading to pale pink, then to her cheeks, the waxy gray warming to something that looked like life. Her breathing deepened, her eyes focused. She looked at Astrid with those dark eyes and said something in a language Astrid did not understand. The words were soft and formal and carried the weight of ceremony. Astrid could not parse the sounds, but she could read the tone. Gratitude. The kind of gratitude that goes beyond thank you, that acknowledges a debt that can never be repaid, because the currency it was owed in was life itself. You are welcome, Astrid said, guessing at the meaning. The girl said something else, pointed at herself. A name. She was giving her name. The sounds were unfamiliar, syllables that did not map onto any language Astrid knew. But she caught something that sounded like quiet, and something that sounded like river. Quiet river, she said. The girl nodded slowly. Then she pressed her hand against the warm cliff face and said something that sounded like wonder. Like a question and an answer at the same time. Like a person encountering something that should not be possible and recognizing that it was. Flint had positioned himself between them, his old body giving what it could, his tail thumping against the stone floor. The girl reached down and touched his head with fingers that were no longer blue, and he licked them. And she said another word that Astrid did not understand, but that clearly meant good, or kind, or something that had no direct translation in any language, but was understood by every creature that had ever been warmed by another creature's generosity. 3 beings in a stone shelter. 2 women who did not share a language, a history, a culture, or a single assumption about how the world worked. And 1 old dog who had never needed words for anything. The sound came at 3:30. A crack. Not the crack of ice or the crack of wind. The crack of wood under stress. The sharp, explosive sound of a material reaching its breaking point. Astrid sat bolt upright. Quiet River was awake too, staring at the ceiling with terror in her eyes. She did not need to speak Astrid's language to understand that sound. Every creature that has ever sheltered beneath a roof understands the sound of a roof beginning to fail. The crack came again, louder, closer. Astrid grabbed her hatchet and moved toward the front of the shelter where the sound seemed to be originating. In the dim light of the dying fire, she could see the walls, still solid, still holding. The clay was intact, the stones were in place, but something was wrong. She could feel it, a vibration in the structure, a tension, like a bowstring pulled too tight. And then she saw it. The 3rd roof pole from the left, the one she had been most worried about during construction, because the fit against the cliff was not quite right, because the ledge it rested on was too narrow, because she had reinforced it with an iron spike driven into a crack, but had never been fully confident that the spike would hold under real pressure. The pole had shifted. Not much, perhaps an inch, but she could see the gap where it had pulled away from the cliff face, a dark line of empty space where stone and wood had been touching and were now separated. The weight of snow accumulating on the roof was pushing down. The cold was causing the wood to contract, to shrink, to pull away from surfaces it had been tight against when the air was warmer. The pole was slipping. If it slipped another inch, the pole beside it would take the additional weight. And that pole was not strong enough to hold its own load plus the load of its neighbor. If the 2nd pole failed, the 3rd would follow, and then the roof would come down. All 950 pounds of earth and brush and frozen snow down onto 2 women and a dog in a space too small to dodge anything. Astrid grabbed the pole with both hands and pushed upward. Her joints burned, Her shoulders screamed. Her fingers, already stiff and swollen, felt like they would snap from the pressure. The pole did not move. She pushed harder, put her back into it, put her legs into it, put everything she had into a single upward thrust against a piece of wood that weighed 60 pounds and was being pushed down by hundreds more. The pole shifted, not up, further down. Another fraction of an inch. "No!" Astrid gasped. "No, no, no!" And then Quiet River was beside her. The girl had understood. Not the engineering, not the physics, not the specific mechanical failure that was occurring, but the urgency, the desperation, the universal language of a person fighting to keep a ceiling above their head. She put her hands on the pole next to Astrid's and pushed. Young hands, strong hands. Hands that had not spent 3 months lifting stones, but hands that had walked through a storm that killed and had survived. And the survival had given them a ferocity that age and experience could not match. 2 women pushed, one old, one young, one Norwegian, one born on this land before the Norwegians came. They pushed against a juniper pole in the middle of a storm that was trying to kill everything outside these walls, and they pushed with the combined strength of 2 people who had each separately decided that tonight was not the night they would die. The pole shifted again, still down, still slipping. Astrid released the pole and scrambled to the back of the shelter. The iron spike. She had driven it into the crack where the pole met the cliff as a backup support, exactly for this situation. The spike was still there, but it had shifted too, loosened by the same forces of contraction and expansion that were pulling the pole free. She grabbed a stone from the floor, a good stone, dense and heavy and flat on one end. She placed the spike against the crack and swung the stone like a hammer. The impact jarred her arm from wrist to shoulder. She swung again, and again, and again, each blow driving the spike deeper into the crack, deeper into the sandstone, anchoring it against the forces that were trying to pull it loose. The spike held. The pole caught against it. The downward slide stopped. The roof creaked, groaned, shifted, and settled into a new position. Not the right position, not the safe position, but a stable one. The spike was holding the pole, and the pole was holding the roof, and the roof was holding the snow, and everything was connected in a chain of desperate improvisations that would have horrified any proper builder, but that was, for now, for tonight, for this particular convergence of wind and cold and weight and luck, enough. Astrid slumped against the cliff, breathing hard. Her arms were trembling. Her hands were bleeding where the stone had scraped them raw. The sweat on her forehead was already cooling, turning cold against her skin. Quiet River said something that sounded like a prayer, or a curse, or the name of someone she loved. It was hard to tell. All the important words in every language sound the same when spoken in the dark by someone who has just barely escaped death. Flint padded over from his corner and licked Astrid's face. His tongue carried the heat of a living thing. His old brown eyes, cloudy and dim, were fixed on her with an expression that contained everything a dog is capable of containing, which is more than most humans will ever understand. "Good boy," she whispered. "Good boy." Dawn came gray and silent. The wind had stopped sometime in the hours before sunrise, fading from a roar to a howl to a whisper to nothing. like a beast that had exhausted itself against the canyon walls and finally laid down to sleep. The storm had passed. Astrid pushed the door covering aside and looked out. The canyon was transformed. Snow lay deep on the floor, drifted against the walls in great white waves that rose higher than her head. The juniper trees were bent and broken, their branches heavy with ice. Some snapped entirely, their trunks split open to reveal pale wood inside that looked like bone. The sky was the color of steel, flat, featureless, promising nothing. The cold hit her like a physical blow. She stepped back inside and sealed the door. "We wait," she told Quiet River, gesturing to convey the meaning. "Until it warms." The girl nodded. She understood waiting. She had been doing it all night. By midday, the temperature had climbed enough to be survivable outdoors. Still bitterly cold, still dangerous, but no longer immediately lethal. Quiet River, recovered enough to move, began gathering her few possessions. She had been walking between camps when the storm caught her. That much Astrid understood from the girl's gestures. Walking, then wind, then cold, then falling, then crawling, then finding the canyon, then finding the shelter. She had seen the smoke from Astrid's small fire and followed it to the door. Smoke. The fire that Astrid had been so careful about, so reluctant to build, had saved this girl's life. The thin gray thread rising from the gaps in the door had been a beacon in the killing dark. A signal that said, here is warmth. Here is life. Here is a place where the cold has not yet won. Before she left, Quiet River reached into the leather pouch at her waist and pulled out a small beaded bag. She pressed it into Astrid's hands and said something formal and careful and heavy with meaning. The words were slow. The girl's eyes were steady. Whatever she was saying, it was not casual. It was the kind of thing you say once and mean forever. Then she touched her own chest. Then she touched Astrid's chest. Then she spoke a single word. Astrid did not know what the word meant. She would never learn its translation, never hear it again, never find it in any dictionary or phrasebook. But she understood it anyway. The way you understand a hand offered in darkness. The way you understand warmth when you have been cold for so long that you had forgotten warmth existed. Gratitude. Kinship. The acknowledgement that two lives had crossed in a stone shelter on the worst night either of them had ever known, and that the crossing had changed something in both of them that could not be changed back. Quiet River turned and walked toward the canyon trail, her footsteps punching through the crusted snow. She moved carefully but steadily, a young woman who had been close enough to death to feel its breath on her neck, and had walked away. Astrid watched until she disappeared over the rim. Then she opened the beaded bag. Inside were dried juniper berries, small and dark and fragrant, smelling of the high desert, of wind and sun, and the particular sharp sweetness of plants that grow in places where nothing should be able to grow. Sacred, she had heard. Significant in ways she did not fully understand, but could feel in the weight of the small bag in her palm. She closed the bag and held it against her chest, and stood for a long time in the doorway of her shelter, looking out at the canyon that the storm had tried to destroy and had not. Marta Strand arrived 6 days later. She appeared at the canyon rim on a morning when the sky had finally cleared, leading her horse down the trail with the careful steps of a woman who had nearly died getting here. She was bundled in so many layers of wool and fur that she looked twice her normal size, and her face was red and chapped and aged by cold in a way that would not fully reverse when spring came. "You are alive," she said when she reached the shelter. She dismounted and embraced Astrid with a fierceness that was not just relief, but something closer to rage. The rage of a person who had spent 6 days believing that someone she cared about was dead, and had come here prepared to find a body, and had found instead a living woman with calloused hands and clear eyes, standing in the doorway of a shelter that should not have been possible. "We thought you were dead. Everyone thought you were dead. The storm, I survived. How? The temperatures. The cliff held heat, just like I said it would." Marta stared at the shelter, at the sagging roof and the cracked clay and the rough stone walls that had somehow stood against conditions that had destroyed structures built by men with better tools and more experience and every advantage that Astrid did not have. Then Marta's expression changed. The relief faded. Something heavier took its place. "Gunnar's house is gone," she said. Astrid went very still. The word "gone" moved through her body like a cold current through warm water. "What?" "Gone." The roof blew off in the middle of the night. The walls collapsed an hour later. They survived. All of them. But only because they made it to the root cellar before the worst hit. They burned everything. Every piece of furniture. Every scrap of wood. Every shelf and door frame and window casing, to stay alive until morning. The children, safe. The baby, the one born in the autumn. She nearly died. She was cold for too long. The doctor came from the nearest town. He says she will recover. But it was close. Marta's voice caught on the word "close," in a way that told Astrid exactly how close it had been. Very close. Astrid closed her eyes. Her grandchild. A baby she had never held. Born to a son who had disowned her. A child who had nearly frozen to death in the ruins of a house that was supposed to be proof that Gunnar knew the right way to do everything. Is she well now? She will be. The doctor says full recovery. Good. There was a silence between them. The kind of silence that holds the weight of everything that has happened and everything that has not been said. And the slow recognition that the world has rearranged itself while no one was looking. They know, Marta said finally. Everyone knows. A young woman came to one of the ranches looking for her family. She told them, through gestures and a few words she had picked up, about a woman in a canyon, a Norwegian woman in a stone shelter built against a cliff, a woman who opened her door in the middle of the worst storm anyone could remember and pulled a stranger inside and saved her life. Marta paused. She looked at Astrid with an expression that was equal parts admiration and something that might have been envy. The envy of a woman who had played it safe and survived comfortably, for the woman who had risked everything and survived magnificently. Gunnar knows, Astrid. He knows his house fell. And he knows yours stood. The words hung in the canyon air. Astrid said nothing. She did not need to. The canyon said it for her. The stone walls standing in the winter light, the roof still holding despite the sagging, the cliff face at her back, still carrying the sun's gift, still giving it back the way it had since the first night she pressed her hand against it and heard her father's voice telling her that stone was a stove and sunlight was fuel, and the old ways were patient, and the old ways were waiting. "What do you want me to tell him?" Marta asked. Astrid thought about her son, about the boy he had been, curious and eager, always running, always wanting to help his father, always bringing her crushed wildflowers in his small fist, about the man he had become, hard and certain, so certain he knew the right way that he could not see any other way at all, about the father he might, after all of this, be capable of becoming. "Tell him nothing," she said. "If he wants to know, he can come see for himself." Josiah Cragg came first. He stood outside the shelter with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into an expression she had never seen on him before. Not pity, not assessment. Something that cost him more than either of those things had ever cost. "I have built 3 houses in my life," he said. "Log, frame, adobe. Good houses, strong houses. Houses I was proud of." He paused. None of them could have held through that storm without constant fire. I had to burn every piece of furniture in my cabin to keep my chimney going. Nearly burned my own house down trying to stay warm. He stepped closer to the shelter, running his hands over the rough stone walls, the way a man touches something he is trying to believe in. "I called this a pile of rocks. I called you a fool. I said you would freeze and no one would find your body until spring." He straightened his shoulders. "I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him something physical. His jaw tightened around them. His eyes did not leave hers. "You built something I did not understand, something I did not believe was possible, and it worked when everything else failed." "The cliff did the work," Astrid said. "I just gave it a place to share. Do not be modest." He shook his head slowly. "You saw something no one else saw. You remembered something no one else remembered. You built it alone at 55, with swollen hands and a few dollars to your name." He paused. "Will you show me how it works? Will you teach me?" The question surprised her. Josiah Cragg, who had survived more winters than anyone she knew, who had buried wives and children to the cold, who was the most experienced settler in the territory, asking her to teach him. "Yes," she said, "I will show you." She led him inside. She showed him where the walls were thin and why, where they were thick and why. The angle of the door, positioned to catch the low winter sun. The way the roof sloped to shed snow while still holding enough earth to insulate. Josiah examined each element with the careful eye of a man who had spent his life building things and was now looking at a thing built by principles he had never considered. "Simple," he said finally. "So simple that none of us thought of it. The best ideas usually are." Dagny came a few days later. Astrid recognized her daughter-in-law before she was halfway down the trail. A young woman walking alone, picking her way carefully over slick rocks, her face thin and drawn from a hard winter that had taken the roof from over her head and the certainty from under her feet. "Gunnar does not know I am here," Dagny said. Astrid studied her. Dagny was thinner than she had been. There were circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent in someone else's house, nursing a baby who had nearly died, living with the knowledge that everything her husband had built and believed in had failed in a single night. The storm broke something in him, Dagny said quietly. He thought he had done everything right. The proper house, the proper farm, the proper arrangements for his family. And it all came apart while he watched. He saw his roof fly away. He heard his children crying in the dark. He burned his own furniture to keep them alive. She paused. And he knows your shelter stood. He knows you survived when he nearly did not. He has not said it. He will not say it. But he knows. The children ask about you, Dagny added. They want to know why their grandmother lives in a canyon. Bring them, Astrid said. When Gunnar is ready, bring him too. Dagny nodded once. She did not promise, but the nod was enough. Spring came slowly to the canyon. The snow melted. Water began to trickle again from the seep in the cliff face. Wildflowers appeared on the slopes above, yellow and purple and white, blooming with the particular defiance of things that grow in places where growth should be impossible. They came in waves after that. Families who had lost homes, families who had been living in root cellars and neighbors' barns, families who needed shelter and could not afford to build the conventional way. They came with questions and rough sketches and the desperate hope of people who had run out of options and were willing to try something that every expert had called impossible. Astrid taught them all. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick. She explained the principles her father had taught her, in simple words, the way Tomas had explained them to her when she was 9 and could barely lift a stone. Find a south-facing cliff. Build small. Build against the rock. Thin wall behind. Thick walls in front. Seal every gap. Let the sun do the work. You do not fight the cold, she told them. You let the sun fight it for you. Viggo Strand came back that spring. He was taller now, broader across the shoulders, but his eyes were the same. Careful, curious. The eyes of the boy who had pressed his hand against the cliff on an autumn night and whispered to his brother that it worked. I want to learn, he said. Not just how to build one shelter. I want to understand why it works, so I can teach others. Astrid looked at the young man who had helped save her life when she could not lift a roof pole, who had felt the stone's heat and understood immediately what it meant, who had believed her before belief was easy. Then I will teach you, she said. Through that spring and the next, Viggo came to the canyon whenever he could. He measured, he experimented, he built 2 more shelters for families who had nothing. Both survived their first winters. You are my legacy, Astrid told him. When I am gone, you will remember. I will remember, he promised. I will make sure others remember too. Gunnar came in the autumn. Astrid was sitting outside the shelter, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls when she heard the hooves on the trail. She knew the sound of her son's horse, the uneven gait, the way the animal favored one leg. She did not stand up. Gunnar dismounted slowly. His hair was going gray at the temples. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there before. He walked to the shelter and ducked inside and placed his hand against the cliff face. He stood there for a long time, feeling the heat that still radiated from the stone even now in autumn when the sun was growing weak. He came back outside. "I did not come to apologize," he said. "I did not expect you to. I came to see." A silence stretched between them. It held everything. The years of absence, the words spoken in a trading post that could never be unspoken, the house that fell, the shelter that stood, the baby who nearly died, the mother who did not. "The children want to know their grandmother," Astrid said. "I know. Will you let them come?" Gunnar was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes." A single word, small and rough and insufficient for the weight it was carrying, but enough. He did not stay long. At the rim of the canyon, he paused and looked back. "I will come back," he said, "if you want me to." "I want you to," Astrid said. He nodded once and disappeared over the edge. Many winters later, when Astrid's eyes had grown too dim to navigate the canyon trail safely, Marta came with a wagon to bring her to town. They climbed the trail together for the last time. At the rim, Astrid turned and looked back. The shelter crouched against the cliff far below, barely visible, a dark rectangle of stone that looked almost natural, almost like it had always been there. The roof was sagging more than when she had built it. The clay would need repacking. The door would need replacing. But it was standing. "Thank you," she said, "to the cliff, to the shelter, to the sun that had burned for her through all those winters, to her father, who had taught her to listen to stone, to Eirik, whose coat she still carried, though it had long since lost his smell, to Flint, who had kept her warm and sane and loved through the darkest nights of her life." Then she turned and walked away. The cliff still stands. The sandstone face still rises above the canyon floor. It still absorbs the sun all day. It still releases the heat all night. It still remembers. And if you are listening to this story, perhaps you too are facing people who say you will fail. People with decades of experience and practical knowledge. People who cannot imagine any way but their own. Remember Astrid. Remember that sometimes the person who knows the least about how things are usually done is the person who knows the most about how things actually work. Remember that stone remembers the sun, and so can you.